Thank you very much for your welcome. It's great to be here with you, my first time in Auckland. The lecture, as you might guess from the title, deals with some of the themes in my book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which some of you may know. But I'm starting, as it were, in a different place. I want first in this lecture to look briefly at the way in which apostolic eyewitness functioned as a criterion in the period, 2nd, 3rd centuries, when Christianity was sorting out what we call the canon of the four Gospels. By which I mean an authoritative collection of four Gospels, no more, no less. The four Gospels we have in our New Testament, as authoritative scriptures for the church. And this was, of course, a critical process, because in a sense, early mainstream Christianity was, by means of this process, defining itself. It meant that to be a Christian was to believe in the Jesus to which these four Gospels witness. And that, of course, remained the case throughout all the subsequent history of the church. And basically, I think, for the most radical New Testament scholarship of recent years has not succeeded in changing that. It matters very much for Christian faith that these four Gospels are, in the sense the early church meant, which I still have to define, are authentically apostolic. So my first section, the fourfold Gospel canon, how did it come about? The four Gospels we have in our New Testament were, I think, already from the time that they began to circulate around the various local communities of the early Christian movement, regarded as apostolic in the sense of being soundly based upon the testimony of those disciples of Jesus who had been close to him throughout the events of his ministry, death and resurrection. But by the later 2nd century at least, there were lots of other Gospels around, and most of them claimed to be apostolic, bearing names like Thomas, Philip, Mary, James, and others. How did the mainstream church's four-gospel canon emerge from that plethora of candidates for authoritative gospel status? There were, after all, several possibilities. The church could have opted for just one gospel, as one leader of an early Christian sectarian group, Marcion, did, choosing Luke and carefully editing it to conform to his own teaching. Or the church could have adopted a gospel narrative created out of all four, or even more gospels, the various sources interwoven and absorbed into a composite gospel. Such a work, the Diatessaron of Tatian, was actually produced in the late 2nd century and enjoyed considerable popularity. And is an obvious way of surmounting what might be seen as the problem between having several different gospels. So there's that second option. Thirdly, of course, more than four gospels could have been accepted as authentic, the option that some of the Gnostic groups took. It wasn't necessarily obvious that the outcome of whatever processes of debate and discernment went on should be a canon of precisely these four Gospels. The principal criterion of gospel canonicity that operated in this period was evidently apostolicity. The elevation of these four Gospels into a canon, an exclusive position, rested on the claim that all four of these Gospels are apostolic and that only these four are apostolic. I'll explain in a moment more carefully what was meant by apostolic, but it's worth noticing how that term served to guarantee the retention of the four Gospels as such, as well as to rule out others that were deemed not to be authentically apostolic. The use of this criterion, I think, explains why the Gospel of Mark was retained for use in the church, despite the fact that it seems to have been very little used in the 2nd century, or indeed in the following centuries of the early history of the church. It was very little used for an obvious reason, because most of Mark reappears in the longer Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which contain lots of other interesting, useful material. Why bother with Mark when you could use Matthew or Luke and get the same stuff as Mark plus additional material? So Mark was actually very neglected in the early church. But Mark's Gospel was believed to derive quite closely from the testimony of Peter. And so it retained its place among the 4 Gospels, I think, because it was apostolic. The criterion of apostolicity also, I think, prevented the church opting for something like Tatian's Diatessaron, a combination of all the 4 Gospels woven into a single narrative. This must have been an attractive option. And of course, down through the history of the church, there have often been productions of that kind, which in some ways people have found preferable to the 4 Gospels. But the sense was doubtless that the 4 Gospels were what came from the apostolic age and should be retained, and should not be superseded by a new Gospel, even if it was entirely compiled from the contents of the 4. Now, what was meant by apostolicity? This notion, as used by such authors as Irenaeus and so-called Muratorian canon, comprises, I think, 3 aspects. First, there was an important chronological aspect. Apostolic Gospels must derive from the apostolic age, which the writers of the early church thought of as ending about 100. They didn't, of course, count years in years AD or centuries as we do, so the sort of round figure of 100 meant nothing at all to them. They wouldn't have used that date, of course. But nevertheless, as it so happens, it was about that point in our calendar when John's Gospel, regarded as the last to be written, was generally believed to have been written. So the apostolic age was thought of as ending somewhere around the year 100. And so we find, for example, that the Muratorian canon disqualifies from canonicity a work known as the Shepherd of Hermas, a book by an early Christian prophet. The author of the Muratorian text actually recommends the Shepherd of Hermas for reading. He regards it as orthodox and valuable, but he does not think it should be read publicly in church worship because of its post-apostolic date. Now, that's not the case of the Gospel, but even more so would the issue of the date of origin apply in the case of the Gospel. Secondly, apostolic Gospels come from the circle of the apostles of Jesus. Now, this narrows the criteria not only from the apostolic period, but also from the circle of those to whom Jesus himself gave the authority to preach the Christian message. Not just the 12, but all of those who had been commissioned. The apostles were those who could be relied on to know what the true gospel was. Now, I said from the circle of the apostles, and that is quite important, because Irenaeus and others like him did not think that Mark and Luke were themselves personal disciples of Jesus. But their gospels qualify because they were in close touch with the apostles. So we should not take apostolic authorship too strictly. It means, rather more broadly, those who were really in a position to know what those who had been close to Jesus taught. And then thirdly and finally, apostolicity does imply conformity with the mainstream church's tradition of teaching. And therefore, even if one could not otherwise determine the historical origin of the gospel ascribed to Thomas or Mary, and of course their means of determining historical origin were quite limited, But one could still tell from the teaching of such a work whether it was authentically apostolic or not. If you have some works that you're quite sure are genuinely apostolic, and you can use that as a little test for others if their teaching does not conform, then they cannot be genuinely apostolic. That's an important aspect and deserves more discussion, really, but for the purposes of this lecture, I want to focus on the issue of a personal link with actual apostolic figures, personal disciples of Jesus, as the key claim that was being made when the Gospels were judged to be apostolic. So that's my account, a very brief account of a very complex and debated topic of what happened over a long period in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but as much as I can do this morning. My second section is called The Fate of Apostolicity in Modern Gospels Scholarship. Now, to validate the four-gospel canon as apostolic in the sense the early church intended, one really has to give some credence both to the titles of the Gospels and to the early patristic testimonies to the origins of the Gospels, both of which indicate the Gospels had close connections with the apostolic eyewitnesses themselves, whether or not any of the Gospels was actually written by such an eyewitness. Such a view of the Gospels has become unusual in Gospel scholarship, but this was not always the case in modern New Testament scholarship. What has been overwhelmingly responsible for discrediting such a view of the Gospels is undoubtedly the approach to understanding the Gospels and their origins, which is known as form criticism. The approach pioneered around 1920 by Rudolf Bultmann and Martin Debelius, which had an enormous influence on subsequent Gospel scholarship. Form criticism had the effect of radically dissociating the Gospels from the eyewitnesses. So any attempt to reinstate apostolic eyewitness as important to the origins and character of the Gospels must engage with form criticism, as I did in my book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Form criticism, I think, should now be regarded as a fundamentally misleading approach to the study of the Gospels. We need to cut loose from its continuing, if perhaps waning influence, but certainly continuing, and establish a different approach. So let me first of all explain the form critical paradigm. Absolutely fundamental for the form critics' approach to the Gospels was the conviction that the Gospels are folk literature. It was axiomatic for them that this type of oral tradition, the folk literature, and they called it folk literature because they compared it with the material that was studied by folklorists, studies of folklore in their time, quite popular in the early 20th century. It was axiomatic for the form critics that this type of oral tradition was formed and transmitted by the folk, not by individuals. Passed down in communities of tradition, passed down as folklore, with no interest of any sort in history. Folklore is, defined as a kind of things like European fairy stories, a good example of folklore. It's the kind of thing that the form critics were comparing the Gospels to. And so the Jesus tradition, by analogy, were anonymous community traditions passed down in the early Christian communities, not connected to individuals, such as those who had been eyewitnesses of Jesus' history, but only to the community itself. The oral traditions were transmitted not by people concerned to relate past history, but for purposes oriented solely to the community's present. And Such traditions, therefore, could be freely invented or even created de novo in accordance with the community's present needs. Now, working on those assumptions about the nature of the oral Jesus traditions as they reach the Gospel writers, the form critics tried to classify the various forms in which individual units of Jesus' tradition were cast. That's why it's known as form criticism. And particularly the concern here was to relate each form of oral tradition, a parable, if you like, or a miracle story, those kinds of different formats of tradition. They wanted to relate each form to a particular function that it would have fulfilled in the early communities. Closely associated was the notion of tradition history, utilizing supposed laws of tradition, what they envisaged as standard ways in which the traditions were developing over time. Using laws of tradition and the assumption that each tradition originated in a so-called pure form, unlike the mixed and anomalous forms that are found in the actual Gospels, it was supposed to be possible to trace the history of a tradition back from the form we have in the Gospels to a reconstructed original version of that particular tradition. That's the form critical view. But tradition history, as such, could scarcely be a tool for reaching back to the historical Jesus himself. And a scholar like Rudolf Bultmann was very skeptical about reaching back to the historical Jesus himself at all, because there could be no guarantee that even the reconstructed early versions of tradition had anything to do with the historical Jesus. The communities, after all, had no concern with authenticity or history. For scholars unwilling to give up the quest of the historical Jesus, therefore, the famous criteria of authenticity became necessary. And these were criteria that were supposed to be able to be applied individually to each little unit of Jesus' tradition, judged whether it went back to Jesus himself or not. And the form critical view of the nature of the Jesus tradition, individual units passed down through the communities, meant that the only way you could possibly imagine getting back to the historical Jesus was by the use of these criteria of authenticity. That's why they became so important in historical Jesus research. But they're entirely a consequence of the form critical paradigm. So let me pass now to criticisms of the form critical paradigm. I'll begin with criticisms relating to the nature of oral tradition. In the light of the much more plentiful evidence we now have from the study of oral societies, and this is quite important, I think. The early form critics may have used the best model available to them of the nature of oral tradition, but it was a model that cannot be supported now. One very important preliminary point to make is the wide variety found in oral or predominantly oral societies of types, contents, functions, and means of transmission of oral traditions. So most generalizations about oral tradition are hazardous, and we should be quite suspicious of arguments about what must have been true of the gospel traditions on the grounds that it is what oral traditions are like. Many features of oral tradition are culturally specific, not universally the same. For example, it is not true, as the form critics thought, that oral tradition is invariably communal, rather than being connected with particular individuals who compose and rehearse the traditions. We now realize how important individual tradents are in many oral societies. The traditions are composed, preserved, and performed by individuals who, while operating, of course, in a community context, are the authorities and responsible for the form in which the traditions are known. Another unjustified generalization is that oral societies have no interest in the past and appear to speak of it only as a way of describing the present. Interest in history varies from one oral society to another, and the issue must be considered in relation to the particularities of specific cultures. But it's quite common for oral societies to distinguish factual accounts from fictional tales and to transmit the two differently. The former with more regard to faithful reproduction of content. An observation important for our purposes is that at least in African oral societies, the kind of account that is treated with special care for its faithful reproduction is often that which recounts events within living memory. It's been widely supposed that oral traditions are normally subject to creative variation from performance to performance, such variation being fully expected by the audience. But Ruth Finnegan challenges this generalization with evidence that other societies, with evidence from other societies showing that more or less exact memorization, she says, of oral texts is also a common pattern, perhaps not over centuries, but over shorter time spans. And interestingly, Finnegan observes that one case in which such memorization may be thought particularly important is that of texts that have a definite religious value or function. An important point about significant variation where it does occur, as of course it often does, is that one performance varies from another, but this is not a process of incremental change, so that each stage of tradition builds on a previous stage, like a sort of series of editings of a literary text. This doesn't mean there can't be changes over time, but it does mean that something like a tradition history cannot be reconstructed, because that's not how change and variation occurs. One performance is not by any means necessarily based on the former in a sort of chain that you can reconstruct. It doesn't work like that. Perhaps the most important general point for our purposes is that oral societies treat different kinds of tradition differently, expecting faithful reproduction in some cases and creative variation in others. When faithful reproduction is required, such societies have a variety of means at their disposal to ensure it. Whether verbally exact reproduction can be achieved may be doubtful, though it's significant that in some cases it's certainly attempted, but substantially faithful reproduction may be both desired and achieved. Methods of ensuring it include both entrusting the traditions to authorized, even trained guardians, and the checking against community memory that will often occur when a tradition is rehearsed. It turns out then that the study of oral tradition in modern oral societies worldwide can set some parameters within which we might expect a particular case, such as the traditions about Jesus, to fall, but permits very little specific determination of what the transmission of the Jesus traditions must have been like. For that, we have to consider the specific cultural context in which it occurs and the evidence we actually have in the Gospels. Before we turn to that, there is a more radical and far-reaching criticism to be made of the form critics' concept of oral tradition in early Christianity. That at best they applied a model appropriate to transmission of traditions across many generations, in a process that occurred they used a model of transmission over many generations to refer to a process that occurred within no more than a relatively long lifetime, which is undoubtedly the case with the Gospels. While the notion of laws of tradition governing the changes that occur over time is dubious in any case, it's certainly not obvious that the same processes of change to which folklore transmitted over centuries may be subject are likely to occur over much shorter periods. We have already noticed that some oral societies treat traditions differently if they recount events within living memory, even though in some cases the latest date when that could be true. It means that the Gospel writers' relationship to the traditions was therefore not that of mere recorders of oral traditions, but, I think to use more precise terminology, it means the Gospel writers were writers of oral history. Now, some people writing about oral tradition make that distinction between oral tradition and oral history. By no means everyone does, but a writer such as Jan van Sina, who is actually concerned with how history can be written, how we can now write history on the basis of oral sources. If you're working in African history, for example, it's very important to think about whether oral tradition and how oral traditions can be used to write history by modern historians. Van Sina makes a clear distinction between oral tradition and oral history. Traditions formulated and repeated by living eyewitnesses still belong to individual memories, which have not yet been superseded by collective memory. To a significant extent, it was the writing of the Gospels themselves that made the recollections of the eyewitnesses into the shared memory of the community. In the oral period, since it was the period of living memory, we have to reckon with the eyewitnesses, something the form critics conspicuously failed to do. My next section called Aspects of the Evidence. We've seen that whether a particular oral society has a real sense of history and is concerned to transmit historical traditions relatively faithfully is a matter of the specific culture. It cannot be predicted a priori. In the case of early Christianity, it has often been shown that Christians did have a clear sense of pastness. Not only the Gospels themselves, but also the traditions they relate, show consciousness of a distinction between the period of the ministry of Jesus and the period after the resurrection. Of course, early Christians were not interested in the past purely for its own sake. Very few people in the ancient world were. But they were interested in the past as the religiously relevant past. Their concern, deriving no doubt from the early Christian movement's strongly Jewish understanding of salvation, history, and eschatology, was precisely with the religiously relevant past. They did not collapse the past history of Jesus into the pure present of the exalted lordship and presence of Christ in the community. This indicates that the early Christian movement had an interest in preserving the traditions about Jesus faithfully. Of course, that doesn't have to mean verbatim. It's quite consistent with a degree of variation from one oral performance to another. But this again cannot be predicted a priori from a model of oral tradition, but must be determined from the evidence we have for the Jesus tradition. Our best evidence is the degree of variation that actually exists in parallel passages of the Gospels, especially if we can assume that the Gospel writers varied their sources in much the same way that one oral performance might differ from another. And of course, anybody can see the degree of difference between parallel passages in the Gospels by opening a synopsis and comparing the text. It's quite easy to do. It's often been noticed that as a general rule, not a universal rule, but as a general rule, there is more close verbal correspondence in the case of sayings of Jesus than there is in narrative. And I think it's very understandable that someone repeating a tradition might exercise more freedom in the way they tell the story than in actually citing the words of Jesus. So that's one indication of the way in which variation actually happened in the tradition. I don't think we have to go beyond the Gospels and speculate. I think we have quite sufficient evidence within the Gospels as to the degree to which variation occurred in the transmission of traditions. Once we've abandoned form-critical presuppositions about the way traditions must have developed, there's probably no reason to suppose that the degree of variation in the tradition was ever greater than the variation we can observe in the extant Gospels. We do not need to postulate original versions of traditions differing widely from the extant versions. And finally, since the evidence shows a basically broadly conservative preservation of traditions, we should not expect sayings of Jesus or stories about him to have been regularly, as a matter of course, invented de novo and added to the form and added to the tradition, as the form critics supposed. An alternative paradigm: eyewitness testimony. An eminent British New Testament scholar of the mid-20th century, Vincent Taylor, who was himself in favour of a moderate version of form criticism, once remarked that if the form critics were right, the eyewitnesses to the history of Jesus must have ascended to heaven almost immediately after Jesus did. He went on to point out that many eyewitness participants in the events of the gospel narratives did not go into permanent retreat. For at least a generation, they moved among the young Palestinian communities, and through preaching and fellowship, their recollections were at the disposal of those who sought information. The point is, whereas the form critics allowed that any authentic Jesus tradition, if there was authentic tradition, then it must originally have come from the eyewitnesses, obviously. But for the form critics, the eyewitnesses played no further part in the transmission of the traditions, apart from initially, as it were, starting them off. By omitting the eyewitnesses from any continuing role, the form critics were able to place several decades of oral transmission between the eyewitnesses and the Gospels. But it seems to me very clear, we have good evidence, that the eyewitnesses did not disappear at a very early stage. The eyewitnesses were around during that period between Jesus and the writing of the Gospels. The eyewitnesses were not only still alive throughout that relevant period, they were in touch with the early Christian communities. Major eyewitnesses, such as the 12 apostles, were very well known. They would have remained throughout their lifetimes the accessible sources and authoritative guarantees of the traditions that they themselves had formulated in the beginning. Moreover, as well as the major eyewitnesses, the well-known disciples of Jesus, there were also many minor eyewitnesses who told the story perhaps of the miracle by which they themselves had been healed by Jesus, or some other encounter with Jesus that had changed their lives. Paul, writing his first letter to the Corinthians around the year 55, 25 years or so after the event, recites a well-known catalogue of people to whom Jesus appeared after the resurrection. Among them, he mentions an appearance to 500 believers at the same time, many of whom, he says, are still alive. This comment would be pointless unless he means, if you don't believe me, check it out with some of those people. If Paul could say that with regard to these minor eyewitnesses, most of the 500 must have been quite minor eyewitnesses, how much more would it have been true of the major eyewitnesses, people such as the 12 apostles and James, the Lord's brother, whom Paul includes in that list? Paul didn't need to say that James, for example, was still alive and well at the time of writing, because his readers would have been well aware of that. We've seen that in oral societies, traditions are not by any means necessarily anonymous community traditions, as the form critics supposed, but can be closely associated with individuals. It could be the case that the Jesus traditions were in many cases associated with the named individuals or groups such as the 12 from whom they originated. And I shall shortly give you some reasons for thinking this. If the eyewitnesses continued to be well known in the early Christian movement, it would be natural for them to be treated as the authoritative sources and guardians of their traditions. And in the last resort, it was they who could ensure the stability of the traditions. Now, I noticed already that because the Gospels were written within living memory of the events, the Gospels should be seen not so much as recordings of oral tradition, but more as oral history. The distinctive importance of attesting traditions within living memory while eyewitnesses are still available is common both to the modern writing of oral history and to the way that history was envisaged in the Greco-Roman literary context of the Gospels. Ancient historians, meaning people who wrote history in the ancient world, believed that history could only properly be written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, whom the historian could himself interview face to face. That demanding criteria of adequate testimony was, even if not always practiced, of course, widely paid lip service to as the ideal historiographical process. So that bad historians who wanted to write history without doing their research properly had to invent claims to interviewing eyewitnesses. Now, in fairly recent scholarship, the Gospels have, I think, been very convincingly argued to be classified as far as their genre, their literary character goes, as Greco-Roman biographies. They fall into the category of the life of a famous person. First readers of the Gospels, that would have been the category they would most readily have put the Gospels into. It's the kind of literature that the Gospels look most like. Now, as contemporary biographies written within living memory of their subject, the Gospels then would be the sort of biography that would be expected to share the best practice of contemporary historiography with regard to sources. So the continuity between the Jesus traditions in oral form and their incorporation in the Gospels should be seen as resembling the continuity between the eyewitness sources and their incorporation in historiographical works, including the Greco-Roman biography. So again, if readers of the Gospels identified them as biographies, as the sort of literature they regard them as, if they identified them as biographies written within living memory, which they could easily do, then they would expect them to be closely based on eyewitness testimony. And they would be alert to indications in the Gospels as to who the eyewitnesses were. So we must now turn to some reasons for supposing that the Gospels really are close to the testimony of the eyewitnesses, and that contemporary readers or hearers would have been able to identify at least the major eyewitnesses to which the narratives were indebted. a starting point here is to observe the way that names occur in the four Gospels. It's a phenomenon, the occurrence of names in the Gospels is a very interesting phenomenon. It's not really attracted very much attention, but it has, I think, some interesting results. It's not, of course, surprising that well-known public figures like Pontius Pilate should be named in the Gospels. Nor is it surprising that disciples of Jesus who play a major part in the narrative, Peter, Mary Magdalene, and so forth, are named. Nor is it at all surprising that most of the more minor characters in the Gospels are anonymous. The Gospels are full of unnamed individuals who come into contact with Jesus on just one occasion, and usually they're not named. What is more difficult to explain, what requires explanation, is that some of these minor characters are named. Why is it that in Mark's Gospel, Jairus and Bartimaeus are named, while all other recipients of Jesus' healings are anonymous? Why does Luke, in his narrative of the two disciples who meet the risen Jesus on the way to Emmaus, name one of them, Cleopas, but not the other? Why does Mark go to the trouble of naming not only Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross, but also his two sons, Alexander and Rufus, who don't even appear in the narrative? And so on. Given that a large majority of the minor characters in all the Gospels are not named, why do they name specifically those few who are named? I think the only plausible explanation is that most of these named persons became members of the early Christian communities and themselves told the stories in which they appear in the Gospels. So these traditions were, as it were, transmitted under their names. It was from Bartimaeus himself that Mark's narrative of his healing came. And Luke's story of the walk to Emmaus came from Cleopas rather than from his unnamed companion. Now, the principle of eyewitnesses from the beginning is my next section. Penultimate section, I think. That little bit of evidence I've suggested to you about minor named characters suggests that the Gospels incorporate some individual stories that were told by the individuals who feature in that story. But if the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony to any larger extent, there must have been eyewitnesses whose testimony covered all or much of the ministry of Jesus. And in fact, we find such a category of eyewitnesses singled out for special importance in the New Testament itself by both Luke and John. In the first chapter of Acts, you may remember Luke tells the story of how Judas Iscariot was replaced by Matthias to make up the number of the 12 apostles. And the qualification to be one of the 12, qualification Peter states when they're selecting someone to replace Judas, was that such a person had to have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day he was taken up from us. The 12 apostles seem to have been seen as the official body of eyewitnesses of Jesus because they fulfilled that narrative. They were the closest to Jesus throughout that period. But Luke's narrative does also indicate that there were others besides the 12 who fulfilled that qualification. It's important that Luke also appeals to this principle of eyewitnesses from the beginning when he writes in his preface that the traditions he relies on for his gospel he received from those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. Those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. People who were with Jesus from the beginning of his public career onwards. those are the key eyewitnesses behind Luke's Gospel, and we may assume also, therefore, other Gospels. Now, if readers or hearers of the Gospels, armed, as it were, with that principle of eyewitnesses from the beginning, wondered who these might be, they may well be looking out in the Gospels for indications of such people. And one of the things they would notice in the three synoptic Gospels is that each of the three synoptic Gospels has a rather carefully composed list of the 12 who also feature in the narrative as being those that Jesus selected to be with him, those who were close to Jesus through most of the narrative of the Gospels. So it would not be difficult to assume from the Gospels that the members of the group of 12 were key eyewitnesses from whom Gospel traditions were derived. But notice, if the 12 were the major eyewitnesses for the broad mass of traditions that we find, shall we say, in Mark's Gospel and the parallel material in Matthew and Luke, then we should also note that there is a key part of the narrative from which the 12 are noticeably absent and could not have served as the eyewitnesses. And that part of the narrative, including the story of the crucifixion and death of Jesus, his burial and the discovery of the empty tomb. Remember, the 12 apostles flee in Gethsemane, and they're not, Peter hangs on, but then he denies Jesus. And after that, none of the 12 appear in the narrative at all. Until in Matthew and Luke, after the resurrection. In Mark, they don't appear at all within the text we have of his Gospel. But those events, the crucifixion, the burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, are crucially important. They're the most crucially important part of the whole Gospel narrative. So surely eyewitness sources would matter here more than anywhere. So if not the 12, who were they? The first readers or hearers would surely expect to be told this. And this is where Simon of Cyrene comes in, along with his sons, through whom presumably Simon's story reached Mark. But even more important are the women disciples. Mark names 3 of them. All 3 are said to be present at the cross. 2 of them, specifically named just 2 of them, are present at the burial. And then all 3 of them named again at the empty tomb. And also noteworthy is the way that they're continually the subject of verbs of seeing. They were looking on when Jesus was crucified. They saw where he was laid in the tomb. They saw the stone rolled away. They saw the young man sitting on the right side. And the young man invites them to see the empty place where Jesus' body had been laid. It could hardly be clearer that it is as eyewitnesses that their place in the narrative is provided. Incidentally, some classical scholars are beginning to recognize that in Greco-Roman historiography, names may sometimes be indications of eyewitness sources. And I now have some evidence of this, which I have discovered since I wrote Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which will come out in the sequel to that book. I want finally, I'm concentrating on Mark, mainly because I can't do everything in a short lecture. So what I said applies especially to Mark, it applies also to Matthew and Luke. But I'm concentrating on Mark also because I want to go on to devote the second of these lectures to Mark's Gospel. But I argue in the book, in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, that in the Gospel of Mark, a major way in which the eyewitness source of Mark's material is indicated by the literary device that I call the inclusio of eyewitness testimony. Now, an inclusio is a common sort of literary feature of ancient literature, and it's a kind of bookend structure. If you have a passage, it could be a very short passage, it could be a long passage, it can be a whole book, but the beginning and the end sort of correspond. There are sort of features of the beginning and the end that correspond, so that when you get to the end, you recognize that it's the end of that section, and the way in which it begins and ends tell you something about the material in between. Now, remember the principle of eyewitness testimony from the beginning, and look carefully at the way that Mark's Gospel uses names. We may notice that the first of Jesus' disciples to be named in the Gospel, and also the last disciple to be named, are the same person, Simon Peter. Peter, of course, doesn't appear at the end of the Gospel, but he's referred to in the message of the angel to the women, and he's referred to by name. And Peter, of course, is overwhelmingly also the disciple who is most often named in the intervening material in the Gospel. Apart from that passage that follows his denial of Jesus, the rest of the Gospel, Peter is actually the most common name apart from Jesus. He appears, he's the dominant character in the narrative apart from Jesus himself. So I think this creates a sort of pattern of reference to Peter, I think, that if you were actually looking for the major eyewitness testimony behind Mark, Peter would be your likely conclusion. And so putting that together with what I said about the 12 at an earlier point, I think Mark's Gospel seems to indicate that it embodies the testimony of the 12, the way the 12 had, as it were, put together a collection of Jesus' traditions as a sort of authoritative body of material. But Mark's Gospel reflects that in Peter's own particular version of it. So we'd expect there to be specifically Petrine elements. We may not be able to distinguish them, but Peter's version of the common tradition of the 12 would seem a plausible way of thinking of Mark's Gospel as apostolic testimony. Now that brings us, finally, to the testimony of Papias. The very earliest thing that we come across in early Christian literature, the earliest comment on the origins of the Gospels outside the Gospels themselves, comes in the work of Papias, who was Bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, beginning of the 2nd century. And Papias famously said about Mark's Gospel that Mark had worked as Peter's interpreter. Mark had been a disciple of Peter who worked as Peter's interpreter, and Mark wrote down the Gospel traditions as Peter had recounted them. Now, Papias was actually in a very good position, both chronologically and in terms of his connections with people, to know something reliable about the origins of Mark's Gospel. And there was a time when most scholars thought that a perfectly credible and plausible view of Mark's Gospel. The reason why it has subsequently been largely dismissed by mainstream scholarship is because of the form-critical movement and the form-critical paradigm. Papias's account of the origins of Mark's Gospel is simply incompatible with the form-critical paradigm, and therefore it lost credibility in 20th century scholarship to quite a large extent. But the only reason to doubt it was because it didn't fit that pattern, that model of how gospel traditions reach the Gospels. If we revise that model, if we abandon the form-critical paradigm, then it seems to me Papias's tradition must again claim credibility and be, as it were, a a confirmation from outside the Gospel of Mark of something that we can observe inside the Gospel of Mark when we look at the role that Peter actually plays within Mark's narrative. So that's what I want to say in this lecture about Mark as, in a sense, Peter's Gospel. In the second lecture, I'll go on to a quite different way of approaching Mark's Gospel that confirms, I think, that role of Peter in the origins of the Gospel. So, to conclude this lecture, to understand the origin of the Gospels, we can no longer rely on the form-critical paradigm, especially in the light of our current knowledge of the nature of oral tradition. That paradigm must be not merely modified, but simply abandoned. I suggest a more fruitful approach to our topic is provided by the paradigm of eyewitness testimony. The Gospels are oral history, based on and even incorporating the testimony of eyewitnesses to the events. Such an approach brings us once again much closer to the assessment of the Gospels that was responsible for their inclusion in our New Testaments in the first place.